Lots to be thankful for. One thing specifically to be thankful for in Whitewater Community Church, one announcement that I failed to make this morning, Mark, is that love is in the air in Whitewater, and there's a new engagement to be announced this morning. At Thanksgiving, we always have this time to be thankful for people, and this morning I'm extremely thankful for Victoria and her love for Mike Schultz this morning. Congratulations. Any words over there? Yeehaw. Man, what took so long is the question, right? How long you guys dated for, like 2-3 years? Congratulations. Hope it was a happy Thanksgiving. Looking forward to your guys' marriage to one another. It's going to be good stuff. Even the secular atheists and scientists are concluding today that the human race is very unique. We are distinguished. We are separated from all other species, all other animals that we have in the world. And the reason why we are unique is because one of the main things that people keep coming back to is that we have the ability to think and ponder about the meaning of life and the reason why we exist. Unfortunately, this pondering has led to this meaningless shaped hole in our culture, in our society. Even an atheist will say that we are distinguished, we are unique in our ability to think through life and why we exist. But as we think through that, it has led to this despair and to this hopelessness. Just give you a few examples. George Michael wrote a song recreated by Limp Bizkit. If you're from my generation, you know what I'm talking about. And he says that all of meaning in life basically comes down to faith. You got to have faith, faith, faith. I got to have faith, faith, faith. There's no meaning to life. There's no meaning to our days. There's certainly no meaning to our suffering. We just have to have faith that the meaning is somewhere in there. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the greatest French philosophers, has said in his book, Being and Nothingness, he wrote, it's kind of a mantra of his. He says that man is a useless passion. And when he wrote that, what he meant was that we have passions, we have real desires, but at the end of the day, we're going to die. At the end of our lives, we're going to die, and so all these passions and desires that we have are completely useless. British thinker, logician Bertrand Russell said this: all human labor, love, and genius are destined for extinction in the vast death of the solar system, which has resulted in the unyielding despair of the soul. And so the conclusion is, yes, we are very unique in our ability to think through the meaning of life, but those thoughts that we have pondered have only led to despair and hopelessness. Harvard scientist, where do you find meaning? In life, you've got a meaningless world, you've got a meaningless culture, and you've got meaningless suffering. A scientist from Harvard, Stephen Jay Gould, he says this. He says, there is simply no meaning to life, period. But this fact, though superficially troubling, if not terrifying, is ultimately liberating. And he says we must construct those answers about meaning in life for ourselves. What's meaningful for you is meaningful for you. What's meaningful for me is meaningful for me. Keller concludes this: in the modern era, we mourned the loss of meaning in this life. But in the postmodern era, an age of freedom, we say good riddance to the very idea of meaning in life, that there is none. Well, how does losing all meaning in life lead to a liberating feeling? How does this lead to freedom from our thoughts and liberation? Well, if none of life has meaning, just think about it. You can do whatever you want to do without any consequences whatsoever. You might as well eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. And naturally, all of us, if there is no meaning in life, naturally, left to ourselves, we would all do what we want to do. We would give in to our pleasures. We would become completely narcissistic, Anything that we wanted to do for the betterment of ourselves, our self-satisfaction, our self-pleasure, is what we will ultimately pursue. This is where the meaning of life has come down for today's greatest thinkers. A movie came out not too long ago with Tom Cruise. He plays an agent. It's a little older movie, Jerry Maguire. And Jerry Maguire, there's two main characters in this movie. Jerry Maguire is an agent for professional football players. At the beginning of the movie, he basically loses all of his players that he's working for, which means he loses his salary and everything about his career. Except there's one player that sticks with him. It's a wide receiver from the Arizona Cardinals named Rod Tidwell. Cuba Gooding Jr. plays this role, Rod Tidwell. And there's this line in this movie that is stuck with, it has been coined in our society. It's a telephone call from Rod Tidwell, this receiver from the Arizona Cardinals, to his agent, Jerry Maguire. And he repeats this line over and over again. And he basically says as a receiver, he says, Jerry, you're my agent. And I can suffer through football. I'm a wide receiver. I can go through the middle and catch a pass and get totally inebriated by a linebacker who's twice my weight, twice my size, and I'll wake back up from my concussion and I'll do it again and again and again. I will suffer for the goodness of my football team if, and only if, you can do one thing. If you can show me the money. I can suffer all day long if you can give me the cash value in suffering. And so he goes back and forth and they say, show me the money. What is in this suffering for me? What do I get out of it? Where's the profitability? This morning I want to look at 1 Peter chapter 4. We're going to look at 12 through 19. And all of us have this tendency to approach suffering like Rod Tidwell approached football and what he did for a living. All of us can look at the difficult situations in life and we can muscle up. We can bear down deep and get through them if we can see the cash value behind suffering. If we can know, you show me the money, what's in this for me? And I can suffer through just about anything. Well, why is that? And how do we deal with that? What does Peter have to say about it? 3 things. Why do we struggle so much with suffering? We struggle with it in our culture. Why is that? Number 2, what's at the center of suffering? What is God trying to accomplish in us through these issues, these difficulties that we go through? And number 3, what's the cash value? At the end of the day, what's in it for us if we suffer well? Why do we struggle so much with suffering? What's the center and what's the cash value of suffering? Number 1 is the struggle. Why do we suffer so much with struggling? Look at 1 Peter 4, verse 12. Peter writes, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though some strange thing were happening to you. Now, Richard Dawkins has a great quote, and this is something that is very, very famous in media and culture today. Richard Dawkins, a confessed atheist, says this: the total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. It's not even worth it to think about all the suffering that happens in the world. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replications, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice in it. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at the bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. And what I want you to think about is all the assumptions that Richard Dawkins just gave in those few sentences. Number 1, all the physical forces in the world are natural. There's none of them are supernatural. Everything that happens in life can be reasonably and naturally explained through science and what we observe from nature. And that means that the natural forces of nature must be blind. They don't care. They just are. They do what they're going to do. Number 2, life is nothing more than genetics and replication. The right amount of particles have come together, the right essences and substances have come together to create life and to sustain life. This is the world in which we live, according to Dawkins. Number 3, I can't see any rhyme or reason for suffering, so there must not be a rhyme or reason for suffering. And the conclusion is that God in suffering isn't worth decent contemplation, because if there is a God, he is completely indifferent to it. And if this is your belief on suffering, of course you're going to spend the rest of your life like the world spends their life in suffering. Avoid it at all costs. It is an evil hiccup. Do whatever you can do to get around the struggle of suffering. Peter says something completely different, but he acknowledges this. We struggle with suffering. And he gives 3 reasons why. Look at your first reason, verse 12. We struggle with suffering because we never see it coming. Suffering surprises us. It catches us off guard. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial. Suffering seems to come when we least expect it. Suffering is always all of a sudden. You know, we hear this a lot in marriages, especially. We've been married for 13 years, and all of a sudden, Brandy says that I'm the issue in our marriage. Where's she been for the last 13 years? I don't know. But all of a sudden, here it is, and our marriage is going through a difficult time of suffering. We deal with it in parenting. Oh, not my sweet Henry. He would never do anything like that. And so we suffer with our parenting when our kids do something crazy because we, think that they're not sinful and living in a fallen world like the rest of us. The reason we never see suffering coming is because we don't see the nature of sin in our own lives. One of the reasons is we fail to see the nature of sin. One man has said, at the heart of personal evil is not so much the usual run of wayward thoughts, cutting words, and damaging acts that we do. The heart of sin is rather the persistent refusal to tolerate a sense of sin and to take responsibility for it. Sin is ultimately the self-swindler. At its core, it is deceptive and deceiving. Cornelius Plantinga says this, in sin, we play the role both of perpetrator and victim because all of us know the truth, but we don't know the truth because we persuade ourselves of the opposite of the truth. We actually forget that certain things are wrong and that we have done them. And listen, I'm not saying that all suffering is due to your personal sin in your life, but I am saying that sin at its core is delusional. And it is deceitful, it is blinding, and it will reveal a lot of things about our hearts when we go through suffering and what we expect out of this world. Peter says, don't be surprised. Don't be surprised at this. The King James Version is the best. It says, think it not strange. That word for surprise or strange in your text is related to the noun for stranger in the New Testament. And the image, the picture, is entertaining strangers or bringing people into your home through hospitality to somebody that you barely know. Literally, when you read the beginning of verse 12 in 1 Peter 4, we should read something like this. Do not take in suffering like you're taking in a stranger. Take in suffering like something that you know extremely well. And, in addition, something that you expect to happen in your life. The second reason we struggle with suffering is because it's painful. When we suffer, there's pain that comes into our life. Peter calls it a fiery ordeal, a fiery trial in the ESV. Do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you. These are the situations in life that burn. And when we suffer through these burning situations, they almost always leave a mark. Now Peter, he could be referring specifically to the literal persecution of Christians in the first century. Those who were burned for their faith, who went to the stake for their faith. He also might have Daniel 3 in the background here, the fiery ordeal that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego went through in Daniel chapter 3. Whatever the case is, suffering is painful. And modern people don't understand suffering because we don't understand pain. We don't think that there's any good use for pain at all in our lives. Argument from the atheist is very common. It goes back to the Middle Ages. If God is willing to prevent evil, but he is not able, then God is impotent. He is powerless. If he is able to prevent suffering, but he is unwilling, then he is malevolent. And the conclusion is this: we cannot see a good reason for suffering and pain in our life, so there must not be one. That's about as good as it gets. Evil doesn't make sense, so it can't make sense because we can't wrap our minds around it. Third reason we struggle with suffering. 1 Peter 4, verse 12. It's strange. Look at the end of the verse. Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal when it comes upon you to test you, as though some strange thing were happening to you. We can't comprehend it because it's strange. It's not normal. It seems to be out of the norm. C.S. Lewis wrote the Screwtape Letters, and it's a fictional account of Uncle Screwtape talking to his nephew Wormwood, and he's coaching him through how to deceive, how to oppress spiritually, satanic oppression, demonic oppression on other people. And he gives them these lectures and these lessons over and over again in the Screwtape Letters. And one of the things that Uncle Screwtape says to his nephew Wormwood is he says, sometimes suffering can be used to our advantage, but other times, especially in middle age, with people pursuing a career and comfortable in life, sometimes the best thing you can do with a middle-aged person is give them blessings, is to take suffering away from their lives. And so here's what he says. He says, Uncle Screwtape to Ethan, maybe you bring me that bottle of water that's right next to you. I always forget my water when I come up here. Uncle Screwtape writes this to his nephew Wormwood. Is it not? It's not even there. Am I making it up? There it is. Thanks, buddy. You're a good man. Next time, drink Pepsi. Okay. That is unscripted. Maybe I'm a little monotone up here. Is that what you're trying to say? Putting everybody to sleep. Uncle Screwtape says to Wormwood, he says, we want man hag-ridden by the future. We want a whole race perpetually in pursuit of the rainbow's end, never honest, nor kind, nor happy. We want them that way now. And he says this, you see, it's hard for these creatures, speaking of humans, he says, it's hard for these creatures to persevere. He says, the routine of adversity, the gradual decay of youthful loves, youthful hopes, the quiet despair of ever overcoming the chronic temptations in life, the drabness which we are created in their lives, the inarticulate resentment, all of this provides admirable opportunities of wearing a soul out by attrition. He says, in suffering, we can use that demonically to wear souls out by attrition. But if, on the other hand, the middle years prove prosperous, our position is even stronger demonically. He says, prosperity knits a man to the world. He begins to find his place in it, when really it is finding its place in him. And he says this, whatever you do, keep your patient as safe as you possibly can. Why do we struggle with suffering? Satan does everything to take suffering away from us. Then when it comes, we think that it's strange. It's not normal. It's a fiery order. It's painful. Number two, what's at the center of suffering? What is God doing? What's he trying to get to in suffering? Look at verse 13. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's suffering, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, as an evildoer, or as a meddler. If anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. And here's the question this morning. What benefit comes from suffering? What is God working when he's trying to do this in our life? And the answer to that question is different than almost all of us naturally think. Typically, people approach suffering like they do a long winter or the stomach bug. You hunker down, you batten the hatches, you grind it out, you realize that life is going to be tough, but you can get through this. This is the Stoic approach to suffering. Keep your head high. It's not going to faze you. And actually, the Stoic view of suffering is really close to the view of the Buddhists of suffering. And both the answer to the Buddhist and the Stoic is the exact same. Suffering comes from unhealthy desires that we have in our life. And so in order to overcome unhealthy desires and suffering, the answer is to detach your loves, detach yourself from your desires, detach yourself from the world. Most of us, if we can get through suffering, it'll come because we detach ourselves from loving anything too much. Well, Christianity says the exact opposite of that. It says because God has loved you, in fact, you should love people more. You should be drawn to God, and you should attach yourself to Him even more than you would detach yourself. Even the Christian will say that suffering in this life has some kind of salvific value to it. This is the Russell Crowe gladiator approach to suffering. What you do in life echoes in eternity. And there's some truth to that, but it's not all true. Peter doesn't give a hint anywhere in the New Testament in his letter. The Bible doesn't give any hints that suffering will lead to salvation. That if you get through this in a certain way, you will be saved. Suffering is not for the forgiveness of sins. Your suffering will never atone for your sins, and it will never give you a place of righteousness before God. Instead, Peter says that suffering leads to identification with Christ and unity with God's glory. Identification to Christ and unity with God's glory. Peter says, rejoice in suffering, because when you suffer, you identify yourself with Jesus Christ, and you share in His sufferings. Look at verse 13. Rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings. That's koinonia, a deep fellowship, a partnership in the sufferings of Christ. We suffer as He suffered. We share in the sufferings of Christ. We identify with those sufferings. But suffering also unites us to Christ. Not necessarily now, present day, but suffering will unite us with the glory of God that is yet coming in the future. And so in verse 13, we identify with suffering, we unite in the glory of God in suffering. But identification in suffering and uniting in the glory of God in suffering is not what we want. What we want is control. What we want is to know when suffering is going to come so that we can have control over it. And so Peter, now he's going to address two types of suffering. He's going to say that there's a proper way to suffer and there's an improper way to suffer. Here's the improper way. Verse 15. Let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a meddler. And just about every commentator that you read, this is a list of sins here. He lists 4 of them. Every commentator you read is going to say something like Peter is moving from the worst kind of sins to the least kind of sins. These are the really atrocious sins, and these are the more acceptable sins. This is a argument from greater to least as Peter is working through this. But the question is that the point that Peter's trying to make? And we just read through the Gospel of Mark not too long ago because we got to talk about this. In Mark 7, Jesus does almost the exact same thing that Peter is doing. In Mark chapter 7, the Pharisees will come to Jesus and they say this. They say, "Why do your disciples do what is unlawful and not wash their hands before they eat?" And Jesus almost gives this retort to the Pharisees that's exact same. He begins to list the exact same sins that you see in 1 Peter. And he says, his argument, Jesus' argument in Mark 7, isn't from greater to least. His argument is actually from least to greater. He says, sin is not what you do on the outside. Sin is actually on the inside of you. He says, sin is not about washing on the outside. Sin is about what's on the inside, what's at your heart, what's in your heart. And everything that Jesus lists, he goes down and he says, from within the heart proceed evil thoughts, sexual immorality. Then he talks about murder, theft, adultery. He goes from the least of sins to the greater. Peter goes from the greater of sins to the least. And they both talk about almost the exact same sins. Almost every sin that Peter mentions is the same sin that Jesus mentions in Mark chapter 7. Now, why would Jesus include evil thoughts on the same list of sins as murder and adultery? And why would Peter include meddling in somebody else's business in the same list of sins as murder? And the answer to this is that Peter and Jesus, they're both doing the same thing. They don't care as much about the fruit of sin as they do about the root of sin. They don't care about the sins that are committed on the outside as much as they care about where sin starts on the inside. And just as Jesus gets to the heart of sin in Mark chapter 7, 1 Peter gets to the heart of suffering in 1 Peter chapter 4. There's Tim Keller wrote Counterfeit Gods. It's one of his greatest books on idolatry. I really commend it to you. He gives this illustration. I want to share it with you. It's a really good illustration. Tim Keller's a pastor in Manhattan. He's recently retired from his pastorate with Redeemer Presbyterian, but he's in Manhattan, and so he gives this illustration about rats in people's basements. All right, now, in Kansas, I don't think we have to worry about rats in our basements, but we do have to worry about mice in the attic, or mice in the basement, mice in the walls, snakes in the basement, these kind of things. But he says, in New York, if you think you have rats in the basement, you can come to a pretty good conclusion without actually knowing if they're there. You always hear them at night, scurrying around, doing this little scratching thing. They never come out during the day. Whenever you go downstairs and turn the lights on, you never see a rat or a mouse in your basement. He says, you think you might have rats in the basement, but there's not a way that you'll ever really know unless if you go down in the basement and you turn on the lights and you walk down with a pair of boots on and make all kinds of noise, you'll never find out if you have rats in the basement. But if there are rats in the basement, there's a way to find out if they really are there. You keep the lights off. You sneak down really quietly. And in the quietness of the moment, all of a sudden, you turn the lights on. And you see all these little tails and rats scurrying into the darkness. And you find out, now I know I have rats in the basement. He says this, if you really want to know what's there, you've got to surprise it. What's at the center of suffering? Why does Peter mention these sins, the same sins that Jesus mentions in Mark 7? Sometimes the only way that we really know what's in our hearts is when suffering surprises us. Suffering is when the lights go on. There's rats in the basement, and there is sin and things in our heart. We don't even know they're there. But through suffering, the lights go on, and we begin to see it. The difference between suffering as a sinner and suffering as a Christian is the heart. And the heart wants what the heart wants, and that's as good as it gets in life. I want you to think about it. Why would anybody murder? Peter includes murder, Jesus includes murder. Why would anybody murder? What's at the root of that? And Jesus tells us what's at the root of murder. Hate, anger is at the root of murder. You murder somebody because you hate them, you're angry with them, and so you want to do something to take them out of your life. What's at the root of meddling? Here's the opposite side of it. When you meddle in somebody's business, you want to get involved so that you can control the situation. All of it, all of suffering, everything that we struggle with in life comes down to power and control. And that is the interpretation, that is the commentary on Genesis chapter 3. All of sin ultimately comes down to a desire that we have in all of our hearts to control our lives and to want to have power over everything that happens to us. An idol of the heart is anything we look to for things that only God can give. And God will use suffering to penetrate those idols, even when we don't know that they're there. He'll turn the lights on through suffering. What's at the center? What is God doing in suffering? He's trying to turn the lights on our heart and realize that there are some things in there that do not belong. Number 3, what's the cash value of suffering? Look at verse 17. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing what is good. Verses 17 and 18 really seem out of place in this paragraph. Ever since verse 12, this whole sermon has been designed around this context of suffering, and all of a sudden now we've got judgment that falls into the picture. Well, Peter's making a close connection between suffering and judgment in some kind of way in this passage. But furthermore, the judgment depicted in 1 Peter 4, just like we saw at the beginning of chapter 4, has to be the final judgment. This is the judgment that comes at the end of all things. And so Peter now, he's going to depict two judgments. There's a judgment for believers, and there's a judgment for unbelievers. The judgment for believers is called the judgment for the household of God in verse 17. The judgment for unbelievers is the judgment for those who do not obey the gospel. The judgment for unbelievers is in the future. It is a judgment yet to come. The judgment for believers is in the present. It is a judgment now that is directly related to our suffering. Tom Constable says this: our suffering is part of the opening scene in the last act of God's redemptive drama. More severe judgment will follow for the ungodly. We know God is judging us through suffering now, and that the end time judgment is taking place in our life even now. George MacDonald wrote a fictional children's story called The Princess and the Goblin. Have any of you guys read this story before? We just read it at our house. It's a really good story. George MacDonald was a mentor to C.S. Lewis. And The Princess and the Goblin depicts this princess who lives in a huge palace. And everything outside the palace is all kinds of goblins. The goblins live underneath the mountain that is just outside the palace that the princess lives in. And one night, she wanders into the palace. She goes into an area of the palace that she's not supposed to go into. She's very young as a princess. And she goes up this long stairway, and she finds this corridor of rooms and all these doors that are shut. But underneath one room, there's this bright light that is shining underneath the door. And so the princess opens the door into that room, and to her, unbeknownst to her, she finds that her grandmother is there. Her grandmother is like this divine, supernatural figure. She's like this guiding light in the princess's life. And the princess loves her grandmother. She always wants to be near her grandmother. Her grandmother gives her the sense of security and safety. She always says great and wise things to her. And so she does everything she can to be around her grandmother. She's just this beautiful, majestic, this guiding figure in her life. And she says to her grandmother, she says, I just want to be with you all the time. I know that whatever bad is happening in my life, grandmother, if I can ultimately get to you, I know that everything is going to be okay. And she wants to have this way of always getting to her grandmother when times are bad. And so her grandmother says, okay, I'm going to give you away. Her grandmother gives her this ring, and she ties a golden thread around the ring. And she says, whenever you get into a distressful situation or a hard time, I want you to put the ring under your pillow, and you're going to make the string, the golden thread, taut. And you're going to follow that string, and it'll lead you to me every single time. And so the goblins come to her room. They come in her window. They're making all kind of hissing, ugly noises. She's fearful for her life, so she does just this. But there's a condition. Her grandmother says, if you're going to follow this string, this golden thread, it might not take you where you think you need to go, but it will ultimately take you to me. Goblin comes in. She puts the ring under her pillow. She makes the string taut, and she begins to follow the string. And here's what this section says. It's a long passage, but I want to read it for you from The Princess and the Goblin. It says this. It says, she, speaking of the princess, inspected it, the thread, to lead her straight up the stairs to her grandmother. But when she reached the door, to her surprise and dismay, the thread turned away from the stair in the opposite direction. And then to her shock, It led out the door and into the night. And then to her greater shock, it began to lead her up the mountain. And finally, the thread took her right into a cave that led her to the heart of the mountain where the goblins lived. And she plunged in. And she kept trying to say to herself, I know it's going to take me to my grandmother. I know it, I know it, I know it. And she tried so hard to think of her grandmother, but, MacDonald says, her heart was tried dreadfully. The thread took her down steep path after steep path, pit after pit, in the pitch dark, deeper and deeper into the mountains where the goblins lived. Through one tiny passage after another, finally the thread took her to a tiny opening that she had to creep through, and still on she went, obedient to the guiding thread. Finally, it took her to a heap of stones against the wall of a cavern, and up on it she climbed until she found that it vanished right into the heap of stones and left her standing on it. She felt that her grandmother had abandoned her. And then a thought struck her. At least, if she could follow the thread backward to get back home, she could find her grandmother and she could get back home. But when she tried to feel the thread backward, it vanished. And she burst into a wailing cry and fell down on the heap of stones. She realizes eventually that the only way to follow the thread is to move the stones that are in front of her. And so she musters all the strength that she has. And through the tears and through the suffering, she begins to push one stone off the top of the heap after another stone. And eventually she gets through it, and eventually she reaches her grandmother. This is a great picture of suffering. It's a great image of suffering. Because Scripture tells us not to back out of suffering, but to go through suffering. But it also tells us the path. This story says that the path that will bring the princess closest to the grandmother is through the path of suffering. The princess has no other choice except to accept what her grandmother said and go through the suffering. It's the same thing with Scripture and with God. The path that will bring us the closest to God is often the path through suffering. Look at verse 19. Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. And that is one of the only times in the New Testament where you will see Creator used in that sense of the word. There is a distinct connection between suffering and this idea of God as Creator. In creation, what did God do? In creation, God took nothing and made something out of it. What God did in creation is the exact same thing that He does in our life through suffering. In suffering, He takes us to the point of nothing, and He creates something beautiful and glorious out of it. What's the cash value of suffering? What's ultimately in it for us? Number one, suffering is a test. All suffering is a test. Not all tests from God include suffering, but all suffering is a test from God. Look at verse 12. Go back up to verse 12. Do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you. The purpose of suffering is a test. And God is testing our trust of Him, our love for Him. He is testing our motives to follow Him or not to follow Him. He is testing us to see if we will worship Him when times are good as much as we will worship Him when times are bad. Keller says suffering is a test of our connection to God. And the question is always this: when times are good, how do you know if you really love God? When times are good, how do you know if you're truly worshiping Him for Him, or if you're just worshiping God for the blessings and the things that He gives us on the backside? And the answer to that question is you don't know. None of us know whether we are worshiping God from a pure, true heart for God, or whether we're worshiping for something that we get out of it. Did you get in this relationship to God because of what He could give you, or because of what you could serve Him in? When times are good, how do you know if you love God? C.S. Lewis says, in prosperity, God whispers to us. In suffering, He shouts to us. It is His megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Suffering is a test. And suffering is also a purifying judgment. In suffering, the fiery trials purify us in our hearts for God. When you put gold, silver, precious metal to the fire, it consumes the dross. It takes out the impurities, the things that don't belong. Suffering is a test, but it also purifies our hearts and our motives for God. Not all of God's tests include suffering, but all suffering is a test. Number 2, in suffering, there are things that you cannot say about God. Absolutely are off the table. Modern people cannot understand how God could ever use pain and suffering for his glory and for our good. Look at Israel, God's chosen people. 430 years they were enslaved in Egypt. Assyria comes along, 722 BC, annihilates the northern kingdom, makes the northern Israelites their slaves. 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, 125 years later, comes along. He enslaves the southern kingdom, takes them to Babylon. You've got the Holocaust. The modern people conclude that God sounds more like a monster than a good God that can ultimately be loved and trusted. And the modern mindset says this is because we have a desire to control our own destiny. We want to be in control. We want to determine what's right and wrong. And we want to tell God that you are obligated to bless me with no suffering in my life because I have done this for you. I've come to church all my life. I've prayed at every meal. I've done all of my part in this life. Now your obligation is ultimately to bless me. And so when we don't get those things, the modern mindset says God's not there. He doesn't exist. It's a figment of our imagination. If you read Scripture, you cannot say that about God when you go through suffering. The Bible teaches something absolutely, totally contrary to that thought. In suffering, there are things that we cannot say, but there are things that we must say about God. And John 17:5 is one of these things that we ultimately must say about the truth of God. John 17:5, Jesus is praying in the upper room discourse, and he says, "Now, Father, glorify me in your presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed." And what happened in the incarnation when Jesus became man, God took on human flesh. He left the glory that he had with the Father. He suffered. He made himself of nothing so that he might come and redeem humanity. He set his glory aside specifically so that he could come and suffer for the salvation, for the forgiveness of our sins. Just about every religion on the planet will say that their God is always perfect. Their God has achieved this realm of peace and tranquility. Either your God or the spiritual truth that you are trying to attain is one of ultimate peace where anything never goes wrong. There's always complete, perfect existence. And your responsibility is to attain to that perfect existence by overcoming suffering or by realizing that this earthly life it's just a figment of our imagination. The gods of other religions don't suffer. No other religion has a God who suffers. No other religion has a God who became man to suffer and take on suffering himself. You don't have to do this. You never have to suffer if you will just do this path of enlightenment, these steps, ultimately to achieve karma, ultimately to achieve this glorious aspect of living with God. Christianity is completely different because of the glory of God. And God decided that he was going to set aside his perfect, glorious existence in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He set that aside and he became sinful man and he came to the earth to suffer. He wasn't kept from suffering. The central message of Christianity is that God suffered. And he took on suffering that we all deserved. Christianity is completely different because we have a God who suffered. Luther says this: "It is God's nature to make something out of nothing." You saw it in creation. It is God's nature to make something out of nothing. Hence, somebody who is not yet nothing, out of him God cannot make anything. Luther says suffering takes everything away from us. And it takes us to nothing. And then, and only then, do we see our need for God. And then, and only then, can God make us into something instead. Corrie ten Boom, you never know that God is all you need until God is all you have. And he will greatly use suffering in all of our lives. There's a cash value. There is a cash value to it. Let's pray.